I'm John Mulkins, a host and producer of the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast. And welcome to the presentation and welcome to your future. If you can organize to peacefully deliberate over a more effective and more democratic constitution for the United States of America. If you can't, I will be praying for an NHI intervention for all of us soon, because we're going to need some help. I began the podcast in 2021. Bernie Sanders had popularized the term political revolution in his campaign of 2020. He was using it every day, talking about single-payer health care, taxing the rich, protecting Social Security, addressing climate change, ending illegal wars, gun control, the things that most people supported. But I had to face it, there would be no political revolution under the Biden administration, and since then, things have only gotten worse. What did a political revolution mean if a majority of Americans were not consistently represented by their own government? Clearly, there was a bigger problem we had to confront. I had been reading about the history of our Constitution for the previous 10 years, reading books like Aquilamar's Consent of the Governed and For the People, Sanford Levinson's Our Undemocratic Constitution, Jerry Frazier's Toward an American Revolution, and many more. I dug into the convention notes by Yates and Madison, de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and Michael Claremond's The Framers' Coup. In that period, it became clear to me that our Constitution was never intended to be democratic. America was not in a constitutional crisis. Americans were in a state of denial, programmed to believe that we lived in the greatest democracy on earth, but at the same time, that minority rule was far better than majority rule. Americans had been convinced that our political system was somehow perfect, but they thought this was how all democracies should work. Parts of our Constitution are democratic. We vote, we have representatives, but did we, the people, actually govern? Not so much. The framers created a system that protected the minority of the opulent from the majority, just as Madison had hoped. And that system continues to protect the minority today, which is why on April 8th, 2020, Bernie Sanders' political revolution came to a screeching halt. I had to begin the podcast with a conversation about Thomas Paine. His publications not only galvanized support for the War of Independence, but our understanding of democracy and our constitutions. Paine's publication, Common Sense, was massively popular. He said, a tiny island could not possibly rule over an entire continent 3,000 miles away. Monarchy was corrupt. The connection only brought exploitation and war. He believed in self-government. He insisted that ordinary people were fully capable of creating a just and democratic system of their own, capable without kings, without hereditary privilege and titles of nobility. Thomas Paine believed that constitutions should be made by and for the people, emphasizing that they should serve the interests of the living. And he argued that governments and constitutions should be based on reason and justice, created through the active participation of the people and capable of being altered or changed when necessary. Paine's idea was that constitutions are not fixed for eternity, but should reflect the current needs and will of the people they govern. Democracy, he wrote, must be based on equality and justice, and he believed that any form of government should be simple, so representatives could be held accountable, and the people could use their government effectively. I began season 1 with Thomas Paine and Political Revolution in America, featuring Gary Burton, the president of the Thomas Paine National Historic Association, and Harvey J. Kaye on his book, The Promise of America. The United States was ranked 29th on the Global Democracy Index for several reasons. And one is that the framers had created a system to protect private property and to promote the individual accumulation of wealth, not the democratic will of the majority. As season 1 progressed, I would interview Professor Francis Chu, journalist Paul Street, author Robert Ovitz, and many others, and they all seemed to be saying the same thing. It was hard to admit, And maybe that was why Americans had no idea why they were so frustrated with their government. But then it occurred to me, maybe Americans thought minority rule was a good thing. This all led me to a conversation about democratic political systems, how they work and how they differ, because democracies are not all the same. In Season 1, Episode 4, I talked with Aaron Liphart about his seminal work, Patterns of Democracy. Aaron Liphart is a world-renowned political scientist who did a groundbreaking study comparing 36 different democracies. On the podcast, he spelled out his top 10 recommendations for what he would do to fully democratize our Constitution. His number one pick: introduce proportional representation into all of our elections. And he pointed out that we could do that state by state if necessary. Next up, replace the presidential system with a parliamentary system, abolish the Senate, abolish the Electoral College, grant statehood to Puerto Rico and D.C., provide public funding for campaigns, clean up our primaries, expand the court, repeal lifetime tenure for justices, restrain the presidential pardon power, and make voting compulsory to encourage more participation, and make our Constitution easier to amend. That would make our political system more responsive to the democratic will of the majority instantly. I have engaged with a variety of political scientists and scholars on the topic of constitutional change, people like William Howell on presidents and populism and the crisis of democracy, Dean Stephen Taylor on a different democracy, Giuliano Benvindo on Brazil's frenetic pace of constitutional change, Matt Vortrup on death by 1,000 cuts, and Jan Olafsson of the Icelandic Constitutional Council of 2014. I spoke with Sanford Levinson, author of Our Undemocratic Constitution, Daniel Lazar, author of The Frozen Republic, on why Americans have such a crazy reverence for a constitution that is obviously thwarting the will of the majority, yet virtually impossible to change. I ended Season 1 with a conversation with George Van Cleve on his book, Making a New American Constitution. His proposal to form a National Convention Coordinating Committee, or NCCC, is, in my view, the most pragmatic proposal I have seen for creating a new constitution for the United States. We are on borrowed time, and this is no longer a drill. It has been scientifically established. The threats we face today are, by order of magnitude, far more serious than what the framers were facing in 1787. Minority rule is now an existential threat. Erwin Chemerinsky and other scholars like George Van Cleve have all made convincing arguments for constitutional change by the people. I spoke with Christian Fritz on his book, American Sovereigns, in Season 2, Episode 1. There is plenty of evidence that we, the people, have the right, the duty, and obligation to make a more effective and more democratic constitution. The pace of change will only accelerate going forward. Knowing how to peacefully make and to alter our constitutions of government will be our most important tool in the 21st century. If we fail to understand how to do that peacefully, we will indeed be living under the tyranny of the past, the whims of coincidence, or the dangerous impulses of a technocrat or dictator. As an American, I have to say, not on my watch. George Van Cleve has made the most convincing plan I've seen so far. I encourage you all to read his book, Making a New American Constitution. His call for a National Convention Coordinating Committee, NCCC, responsible for education, fundraising, convention rules and guidelines, as well as a date, is the best I've seen so far. While I personally think that any convention should be limited to developing a more democratic constitution, there is a strong argument that any convention should be wide open to whatever the convention delegates feel they need to do. This is what the framers did in 1787, and I suspect that's what we will have to do again, with the hopes that it will result in a more democratic constitution. As George Van Cleve puts it, the time for a new grand bargain has come. George Washington had left us all a breadcrumb, which I found in his farewell address of September 1796. Quote, "The basis of our political systems is the right of the people to make and to alter their constitutions of government. But the constitution which at any time exists, till changed by an explicit and authentic act of the people as a whole, is sacredly obligatory upon all. The very idea of the power and the right of the people to establish government presupposes the duty of every individual to obey the established government. The basis of our form of political system resides in each of us. We are sovereign over our constitutions of government." So if inclined and you want to help build this movement, please join the Democratic Constitution Forum Zoom calls. I'll leave a link in the chat. It's a call that we set up to kind of help this movement develop. Everyone is welcome. And contact me at the link I'll leave in the chat and put in this and send me an email and put in the subject line, send me an invitation to the DCF. The next one is scheduled right now for the 21st, I believe. So that's coming up pretty soon. Otherwise, I hope you found this presentation empowering. Thank you very much for letting me come in the conversation with you and enjoy the rest of the presentation. I'm happy now to introduce my friend and ally, Luke Pickrell.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, John, for that presentation. So my name is Luke Pickrell. I just wanted to introduce my work and then also my worldview, which is, of course, connected and is going to tie into all this stuff. And then also speak briefly about how the US left, I feel, is relating to the need for a democratic constitution. So first, my work, and I'll let folks figure out. There we go. Maybe now folks can see me. First, my work. In two recent articles for Jacobin, I wrote about the 60th anniversary of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, as well as Trump's takeover of Washington, D.C. And on the Voting Rights Act, I noted how the Senate has long been the graveyard of civil rights legislation and how the unelected Supreme Court continues to jeopardize many of our hard-won rights. I pointed out how the court's 2013 decision in Shelby County versus Holder was really a dagger in the hearts of the Voting Rights Act. That was a quote from John Lewis, a dagger in the heart. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act, Advancement Act, has been introduced into Congress, you might know, 6 times actually since then, in an attempt to really repair a lot of that damage. But that bill has never made it out of Congress, even though a majority of Americans support most of what's in it. And when talking about the Voting Rights Act, I also argue that the struggle, and this is really the core of my argument, that the struggle for universal and equal rights and really doing justice to the legacy of the civil rights movement requires getting rid of the Senate and curbing the power of the Supreme Court. And so on Washington, D.C., I point out that Article 5 of the Constitution, which is the Constitution's Amendment Clause, and the Senate have long been obstacles to statehood. I know that there's been more than 150 constitutional amendments to give DC full voting representation in Congress, and all of them have died, just like 99.7% of all proposed amendments to the Constitution. And I say that DC needs statehood, but my contribution through this democratic constitution lens, we'll say, is to say that even if DC did become a state, it would still be integrated into the larger constitutional framework in which each state gets 2 senators, regardless of population. There are really just some 400,000 voters in key swing states that determine the outcome of presidential elections. That's thanks to the Electoral College. And then, of course, we have an indirectly elected executive that wields immense, and as we've seen, really unaccountable power. So besides my writings in Jacobin, my main project is the Democratic Constitution blog, And the blog speaks to the abuses that we see every day at home and abroad, and really tries to take all of those things and tie them into a single point, into a single argument, which is that we don't have political power. So next, I just wanted to touch on my worldview, which I want to describe by laying out some of the history that I think is important. First, the history of social democracy, capital S, capital D, as organized socialism was known before the Russian Revolution. And here I draw a lot from the Socialist Party of America's 1912 program, which calls for a constitutional convention to abolish the Senate and the Electoral College. It also calls for an end to judicial review and for expanded suffrage. And it was reading that program that really changed my understanding of the relationship between democracy and socialism. Because before reading the SPA's program, the left in the US had really taught me about something called bourgeois democracy. And I was told that democracy wasn't radical, it wasn't threatening, it is actually best understood as something that controls people. I've since learned that this idea of bourgeois democracy, this is a perspective that came into power post the Russian Revolution period. And it's really a distortion of Marxism. And that, in fact, an essential part of Marxism is the struggle for a democratic republic, which would be the political system through which workers, the oppressed, so on and so forth, could actually shape the world for the better. And so the logical conclusion from this is, of course, that in the US, the socialist struggle necessitates the struggle for a democratic constitution. Another chunk of history that I draw from is that, and I believe that everyone involved in these conflicts understood a democratic political system as a single representative assembly elected by universal, equal, and direct suffrage. Whether or not those folks wanted that system, a democracy, was a whole other question. And that democratic Republicans, those who did want a democracy, such as Tom Paine, influenced both Pennsylvania's 1776 Constitution, which really embraced this vision. They also influenced the French Constitution of 1793, which aimed to advance those ideals. And although neither constitution lasted very long, the democratic Republican tradition continued within the English Chartists, the European revolutionaries of 1848, radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner during Reconstruction here in the States, and throughout the entire social democratic movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, including, as I mentioned, the Socialist Party of America. Third, I wanted to emphasize the history of the civil rights movement, both within the 1950s, throughout the 70s, the New Left of the 1960s, and then also the anti-Vietnam War protests. And I really believe that the US has a long and proud history of mass movements that clash with the status quo in the name of universal and equal rights at home and abroad, and that these movements have been animated by many different desires. They've produced different slogans, demands, so on and so forth. They all condemned imperialism and economic inequality and focused on the immediate struggle to advance democracy. However, my perspective is influenced by the fact that none of these mass movements were capable of connecting their democratic values to the constitutional structure of our government. That is to say that no one, save for Martin Luther King, just a little bit, oh so ambiguously right at the early end, asked if democracy was possible in a constitution like ours. And so I argue that we can ask that question today, and that people are actually asking that question, asking, is it possible to realize the necessary change we need in so many different areas with this political system that we have? Finally, I want to touch a bit on the US left, because I'm also a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, and I work hard to inject this democratic constitution, democratic Republican democracy first perspective into that space. I would argue that the left outside of Marxism, Leninism actually never really abandoned democratic values and really never venerated the Constitution. I do believe, though, that the left did lose the ability to imagine how it could realistically challenge the whole Constitution rather than just chip away at the consequences of some of its most undemocratic features. But I do think that this is slowly, very slowly starting to change, and that the question of the not only an issue for left, as it is for all of us, but one that it can't afford to ignore. And so what does this change look like? Well, right now within DSA, it's democratically adopting political platforms that label the US as no democracy at all and call for a new and a democratic constitution. It's also writing and passing chapter resolutions noting that, and I quote, the Constitution was originally imposed undemocratically by an alliance of slave owners, bankers, merchants, and landlords to secure their property in opposition to the democratic principle of one person, one equal vote. And it's also writing articles for left publications with high readerships like Jacobin that argue for these positions. So to conclude, I just want to note that we're here today talking about systems, right? And the Constitution is a system. And I would argue it's one that we're trapped within. And so to break free from the Constitution, I think really to open up the political space necessary to push for all these other struggles, to create on which we can add and grow and imagine winning all of these movements that are going on, we have to confront the Constitution. And I would say that as America's political storms are only worsening, in these turbulent times that we're all living in which all kinds of systems are changing, it really is a clear and consistent position on the need for a democratic political system that I think will guide us forward. So thank you very much for listening to my little spiel, and I'll turn it on over to Greg.
I will share my screen in a second, Greg.
Great. Well, greetings, everyone. Appreciate you very much being with us this afternoon or morning or evening, depending on what part of the country or world you may be in. And thanks so much, John and Luke, for your fine presentations. I wanted to shift a little bit now to, if you will, from theory to practice. What does it really mean to try to work at the ground level in trying to create a change that is democratic in our Constitution via trying to amend it? And that is what Move to Amend has been trying to do for the last 15 years. It is an effort to please switch to pass what we call the We the People Amendment that is in the current House of Representatives, H.R. 54, that seeks to, in this case, focus on two provisions. One, to declare that artificial entities such as corporations don't have constitutional rights, aka corporate personhood, to abolish it. And second, that money is not free speech. That goes back to the 1970s. Corporate constitutional rights actually goes back to the 1880s, if not before. And then Section 3 just basically saying that nothing in this amendment would be considered to be a threat to actual freedom of the press. Yeah, I can go to the next one. So, this is something that got going on the very day that the Citizens United decision was passed back in 2010, in which people came together and said, wow, we have to, it's not looking very good. The decision actually was much worse than as it was originally brought before the court about a year before. People came together several months before that decision and developed a strategy that focused on how are we going to do this? How are we going to amend the Constitution? That has not happened actually from a grassroots basis for a very long time. There have certainly been constitutional changes and amendments since the original, of course, 27 of them, but very few have had, really mass movements that have forced Congress to do what otherwise they didn't really want to do. So a strategy of this amendment was to have coalition building, building a broad and diverse movement, focusing on community organizing and not just doing activism of just, events that don't really add up to anything, and really focusing on grassroots organizing. That if we're going to focus on something that is oh so very difficult, that has occurred, as Luke has mentioned so few times, given the history of this country and the number of amendments that have been introduced, it's going to have to take quite a broad and deep, powerful movement. So how do we do that? This strategy was developed from the get-go. Yeah, next slide. And so over the last 15 years, we've amassed over 500,000 signatures on our petition. This has been introduced in the House now, I think 5 or 6 times. I think it's the 5th time, up to 62 House-sponsored in the current Congress, over 800 organizations nationwide, from local to national, that have gotten behind this. More than 700 communities have passed either municipal resolutions through councils or citizen-driven ballot initiatives calling on Congress to pass this. That's been either at a municipal level, over 700 of them, or 8 states have done that as well. And there have been hundreds of what we call pledge to amend signers. These are candidates running for office at every level of government, from local city council up to Congress, who say if elected, they will do what they can to pass the amendment. So this has been our way to try to develop the understanding, the awareness, to get on the other side of the learning curve, to build this movement, both culturally and politically, educationally. Yep, next slide. So what are the challenges associated with trying to pass a constitutional amendment, which has not in earnest been done? I mean, there's no other organization that has been around for as long as we have in recent times that has been at this for the number of years that we've kind of limped along to work on this. And it has been a challenge. There have been some general challenges that I think all efforts at trying to change the Constitution in the current environment would face, though some things, as Luke and John have alluded to, I think are changing in some cases, I think, for the better. And then there are a couple of very specific challenges to just move to amend. But beginning with the general challenge is, I think, right at the top, and I think John alluded to this before, is the general belief is that the population out there, just in general, not so much as much anymore, but the general belief that we the people have had the power, at one time had the power to shape our own lives, and that is includes our communities and country, and that has never been the case. We the people have never been all the people. We have never been authentically in charge, ever. It's not like there's some sort of grand, glorious place and time that we desire and strive to go back to. It's never been a perfect, or even come close to being a perfect democracy in which the Constitution was really on the side of the majority versus the minority, as John and Luke have so well articulated. There's been a cultural sacredness of the Constitution, right? Sort of akin to Moses coming down from the mountain with the commandments, that this is, my gosh, something that is just so incredible, done by these wisdom of founders who had the best interests of us in mind. And it's lasted longer than I believe any other constitution on planet Earth. And particularly over the last year or so now, to a certain extent, rightly so, it has provided the only guardrail against the current attack by authoritarian right. Hey, it's not something right that should be messed with or even questioned, particularly now because it will only feed into the fact that it should be easily ignored, the rule of law and the like. It's not something that really should be considered. The enormous difficulty is mentioned in amending the Constitution, the hardest we've been told of any constitution in the world to change, either internally, because as you may know, there are 2 ways to do it, either through Congress or to do an end run around Congress through the states. Either way is enormously difficult. And lastly, the perception that the Constitution amendment work is really not relevant or is a privilege. Now, this is changing a bit, but to some extent it isn't. It's sort of a conundrum, particularly now since Trump has come back. There are all of these assaults all of these threats, all of these actions, all of these movements, all of these cuts, and there are people responding to those, and incredibly so. But all of that responding is reacting, is resisting, and is dealing with things that are playing defense. And so by talking about and working for a constitutional change in our amendment, but any amendment at this point, is oftentimes, I mean, we've heard, but any amendment could be perceived as, well, that's sort of a privilege right now. Not when, the fire is burning, you need to really focus on, putting out those fires and not asking who are the arsonists. So some of that is changing, but it's sort of, is it not a conundrum in which there's still all of this resistance going on, but people are starting to connect the dot and say, wait a second, there's some systemic issues here that go beyond the immediate threats to any immediate agency or immediate employees that are being laid off or immediate cuts, even the immediate presidency. That really transcends the Trump presidency. Next. Other general ones are the call, there's a tension between those who want to sort of, if you will, reform the Constitution by quote unquote amending it, while saying, no, we don't need to amend, we need to suspend. We need to abort it and start with a clean slate. So there's been that kind of tension that we have heard, and I know that has come up regarding others. The tension also between the various ways of amending, between trying to go through Congress versus this trying to create a convention approach that is, on paper anyway, much more democratic, in practice right now, much more potentially lethal. There's a legitimate, very legitimate criticism and cynicism toward Congress being as rigged as it is and captured as it is by the billionaires and by the corporate crowd. And saying trying to go through Congress right now, given the explosion of money in elections, is pretty darn difficult. And despite the fact that we've garnered 60 some co-sponsors, how many of even those would actually, when the decision would come to actually vote for this in earnest and not just sign up for it, do it? Never mind all the other people, even quote unquote Democrats that are supposed to be more progressive, have not signed up. And then elections in general, we often hear as any effort at trying to bring about systemic change hears, well, it's an election year. Wait till next year. Well, guess what? Next year is an election year. And the year after that is an election year. It's ad nauseum. It's always an election year. It's always the most important election season that has occurred in the history of the universe. So it has always been a challenge. Next. And finally, some sort of very specific move to amend challenges. The belief that I won't spend a lot of time on it, but the belief that Citizens United is the source of the problem. Well, we didn't have a real democracy before Citizens United. The issue about should we try to reform corporations via statutes, laws, versus trying to transform them by dealing with getting rid of this notion of corporate constitutional rights. There are more realistic proposed alternatives out there to our We the People amendment, which is a very heavy lift, things that are much more doable because they have loopholes in them. Something called the Democracy for All Amendment, which people are into, we can get into. Or just simply reversing Citizens United again, which, would take us back to January 19th, 2010, where last time I checked wasn't much of a democracy then. And then a couple stars next to this one, greater media attention and energy focused on other proposed constitutional democracy amendments. By this, I mean, there are other amendments that are being talked about now that on one hand are a diversion, but on the other hand, there's talk about, history does say that when there have been, and history shows, when there have been amendments, yes, they've been passed individually, but they've come in clusters. They've come in sort of a package. Over a short number of years, a number of things have passed. So it could be that our greatest strength individually in trying to pass not just the We the People amendment, but any single amendment may be as part of a package that includes multiple. All right, next. So what are the lessons? And I'll try to go through these very quickly of what it is we have found are some of the takeaways. Well, part of it is we have to call out both political parties, both right now, given that they have been not the greatest on pushing for fundamental change. That's not any different than it's ever been. It's always been people pushing for fundamental changes, always come from the bottom, always come from people's movements. But we do need a few people who are on the inside who are supporters, who have our back inside the political system. We need more of them. And we have to challenge both parties to basically do what they should be doing, which is following the will of the public. And right now, the one party is not doing it at all, and half of the other party, if not three-quarters of the other major party, is not doing it. And that leads to, certainly calls for creation of other parties beyond the two. The nonprofit industrial complex, those organizations that are headquartered inside the Beltway, oftentimes are conditioned to sort of focus on that which is deemed credible, doable, winnable, and therefore don't focus on fundamental change until and unless things look like it's going to happen. Then they run to the front of the line. So, we need to sort of push them on it to try to continue to educate them, but to understand this is kind of how the reality is at the moment. We can't depend on them to lead any democracy movement. That's going to have to come from the grassroots and those who are not inside the Beltway and not part of the nonprofit industrial complex. But we do need them, and hopefully they will come around. There are advantages, certainly, and we need to take advantage of them, of the growing political and economic realities that exist. These certainly, obviously, the blatant effort of authoritarianism and fascism is putting things to the fore of the limitations, of the guardrails, of the Constitution, that, gee, it's not so effective, is it, in trying to protect, quote unquote, democracy, which we've never had. And those things are being exploited. The abuses of corporate power, increasing economic instability, the Supreme Court, the politicalization of it, which obviously calls to deal with it constitutionally. Next, just a couple more here. Continue to address, I think it's very important, move to amend as always from day one. We can pass the We the People Amendment tomorrow morning. And is that going to fundamentally address some of the oppressions, fundamental, that still exist? Just ask a person of color or a woman or a trans person whether they feel that we live in a real democracy. No, they've never had one. Even women, despite getting the 19th Amendment, or people of color, 13, 14, 15, because things like the Voting Rights Amendment and the other Civil Rights Amendment are laws and not constitutions. We know because they're laws, they can be here today and gone tomorrow. And we have seen that fact play out. So we have to address those systemic oppressions and do so in a way that focuses on them to the degree and magnitude that they deserve, not just a law or a statute or a regulation, but a constitutional amendment. Grassroots work, obviously, is incredibly essential to do. It's the only way to build any power, and must collaborate with other amendment groups. Finally, last slide, is, if you look at the history of where there have been effective movements for constitutional change, whether it's the abolition movement or the movement for suffrage, or even changes to bring about the fundamental statutory changes we've seen, civil rights, voting rights, it has always involved people risking arrest and basically trying to appeal to people's conscience and to put their own morality on the line via challenging business as usual. So protest and persuasion certainly has its place, but so does direct action in the form of civil resistance. We have to explore the pros and cons of the Article 5 convention. That is starting to happen. We're not calling for that now. We've never dissuaded it, but some of the people out there and some of the causes out there, some of the groupings out there that are looking at constitutional change are saying in the long term, that is the route to go. And we need to start strategizing toward that end. And finally, to build a democracy movement, it's got to be democratic. It's got to be inclusive. It's got to be independent. It's got to be powerful. It's got to be democratic. If it's not any one of those things, it's too easily controlled by those who are able to pull the levers or push the strings. And it's got to exist, I believe, sequentially. Here, the populist movement of the 1870s and 90s, I think, provide important lessons of the sequential approach to building a truly powerful movement, of developing the first structure. You have to build organization. You have to then develop a way of bringing people in, the on-ramp. What are the ways that people are going to join that movement? For the populists, it was to sort of collectively sell their corn, their wheat, and the like. A cooperative. What is that in trying to build a democracy movement for fundamental democratic constitutional change. I'm not sure. But you have to have some way to bring in the masses. Then they have to be educated radically, and then they have to be politicized. Lastly, we have to plan for the inevitability of the assault that will come from those who are opposed to us, corporate state, the power elite, and the like. And lastly, it ain't easy. Last slide, but never give up, because you know what? Nature doesn't. Thanks. Neither should we.
Great. Thank you. That was great.
Yeah. Thank you, Greg. Thank
Appreciate
you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Luke, for your wonderful presentations. We have about 15 minutes left. We can open it up to a few questions. How's that sound?
Yeah.
All right. So use the Q&A function at the bottom. Submit your
Okay.
questions there, or in the chat as well. Either one.
I love that image at the end, Greg. It reminded me of Emile Zola's novel Germinal, right? Where the seed is growing underneath our feet. We don't see it until it comes up through the ground, and
Yeah.
boom, there it is. The revolution. That's great.
So questions, queries, consternations.
Yeah.
Yeah, looks like we got a question. What other amendments are proposed that could be packaged with move to amend? I'm assuming that's that. Yeah.
There's a whole host, and people have been, I think just talking about. I'm not sure there's been any yet formal organized effort, but anything that deals with sort of democracy around, I mean, certainly based on what the Supreme Court has said and done, dealing with any number of limitations. Now, there's also a package of legislative changes to the Supreme Court that Biden suggested on his last couple of days before he left. And some have argued that one doesn't necessarily need a constitutional amendment for that. Others have said one does. So I'm not sure exactly which would prevail, but that has certainly been mentioned. The right to vote, we don't have technically a national right to vote that is inclusive, has been mentioned as well, among others.
Thank you, Greg. Looks like we got a couple more questions in here. What is the best way for like-minded groups to come together now as a movement? John, Luke, either one of you want to take this one?
Sure, I can hit that. It's I think one thing that is frustrating is working on your own, and there are several organizations and people doing this kind of work. So for me, the objective would be to come together periodically to meet, support, network, and kind of build out from that core group of people who are working in this. And that's why we set up the Democratic Constitution Forum Zoom calls, which does meet periodically once a month. So that's one way. Luke, Greg, you have a suggestion?
No, I mean, I think I think what you mentioned, Sean, is important. I think also sharing these perspectives in whatever organizations or whatever spaces you're involved in. And then, yeah.
I would just add that it is both exceedingly exciting and enormously frustrating right now to see all that is going on. There does not seem to be a single channel, a single route, a single group, and that is both good in that it's decentralized, which is good, so it can't be sort of picked off. But sometimes it can be frustrating, but it's still so early in the process, I think, given the awareness of where things stand and where things are headed, that who knows? It's pretty organic, and at this point, it should be.
Yeah, let's get another this comment more than a question. Providing links for all of your podcast, Move to Amend, and Luke, your work as well. I saw in the chat, it's in there, so I can sort of, once this is over, I can sort of email everybody, or I can just do it now as well, sort of get this out to everyone. But in the meantime,
Okay.
yeah, I got another question in here. We got a few more. If we start today, how long will it take to affect these kind of changes, constitutional changes?
Well, right, no one can predict the future, but the framers did it in 3 months. You know, they didn't have the internet and nearly the kind of knowledge that we have today to do this. I asked AI to create a democratic constitution for me a month ago, and it came out with a beautiful kind of example of what we could do, and that took about 3 seconds. It's all about organizing the majority of people, though, in the United States to support this effort. And I think for me, we need to focus our attention on a committee like George Van Cleve proposes to organize to do that, and that could take a year or two. I would hope that we could get this done before 2028 myself. I think we need to do it. It's kind of urgent to me, so I will hope the sooner the better.
Thank you, John. Anybody else want to?
But it really is up to us. It's hard to know for sure. What's so great about this forum of the Next Systems is that, they're trying to bring together the practitioners and the theorists, and we need the academicians and the activists and everybody in between because nobody can do it alone. The credibility comes from the theorists and the constitutional experts in saying, yeah, this is what's possible. This is what that gives the credibility to it, and hopefully the legitimacy of what they come up with can pass the muster, because of course everything that will be passed, they'll try to get it to become unconstitutional in a sense. So we need one another, and that takes time to build relationships, to build trust, to make contacts, and it's got to a certain extent, as Ben said earlier this morning in introducing this whole program at 8 a.m. or 8:30, that it increasingly needs to become global. While the Constitution in every country is sort of unique, corporate entities now are transcending nation states. And that this is a way to sort of get beyond, just as corporations escape the control of states that chartered companies way back when to go to the federal level. Now they're going from the federal level to the international level and doing it through the horribly misnamed international trade deals that create things called the investor state dispute resolution panels, that are ways to just sort of preempt, or dare I say, trump Supreme Court decisions. So to a certain extent, the work has to be international, but we also have to focus locally, and some people call that working globally, but also locally.
Locally.
Thank you, Greg. There's actually a couple questions in the chat. One of them being, how can, people listening, people watching, get involved hands-on with sort of constitutional change work? Would working on the campaign of a progressive politician locally, would that be effective?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it may be helpful to do that. Politicians do take an oath to defend and protect the Constitution, so there is a inherent conflict in a sense. And this is a project that we, the people, need to organize ourselves. So I'm typically not that predisposed to, work with elected representatives so much. And they're going to need to see the parade to get in front of it, like Greg alluded to earlier. So I think we need to organize as a people, and that's, I think, the Zoom call that we're doing here periodically, we can build out from there. Obviously, we can work with Move to Amend and push their agenda forward. And there are a couple of other organizations, POCLAD, the next Constitution's research lab, with Next Systems. So there are places we can go to work on this. And just get busy and start to inspire people to get involved.
Yeah. Luke, do you have anything to add? Greg, you too.
Well, I think that part of this process is developing effective and persuasive communicators. So I do think that our side, this position, we need good writers, we need good speakers, we need people who are capable of putting this perspective out there in a way that connects with people and then doing it again and again and again and again and again. There are media outlets that put out political perspectives and a worldview and a way of looking at things. And my personal interest with the Democratic Constitution blog is that Jacobin magazine is sort of that for most of the US left, but it has no focus. And it certainly does not have a Democratic Republican perspective that says, look, the US left needs to win the battle for democracy, and that should be our focus. It's sort of all over the place. So I do think that a part of this is creating a media outlet that puts winning the battle for democracy as its focus. And as I said, connects all of the various things that we're seeing back to this goal that we have.
Thank you, Luke. So just a quick time check. There's about 6 minutes left. We have time for at least one question, maybe two. And I see one here in the chat. Another one. Viewer said, when citizens are being snatched off the streets, I just don't think constitutional change is top of mind. Can any of you speak to this?
Well, I think to a certain extent that is legitimate. It's one of the things that, is the challenge when people are responding and reacting, resisting to immediate harms. Changing the Constitution is about as far away as one can imagine. Yet the antecedents of how this happened is because we have a set of leaders that got into the position that they're in precisely because of billionaires and corporate entities sort of having not just the power, but the right, as in the constitutional right, to donate unlimited amounts of money and corrupt the political process. So it is sort of a conundrum. Where do you start? This is sort of kind of a logical result of the problems of our undemocratic constitution. And so there's always short-term, mid-term, and long-term things. And short-term, I can exactly see why some people would say that. And so maybe what's important is to always contextualize. Yes, that should be opposed, but you know what? Where are those people ending up going? They're being put in, and this whole drive to capture people and putting them in prisons is being driven, in a sense, by the prison industrial complex that are making money by housing people in these temporary prisons before they get deported, as things are increasingly being privatized and corporatized, including sort of deporting people. So, it is all connected. And so contextualize it, yes, we need to stop that immediately. But to say part of why we need to stop it immediately and why this is happening is in part because the system is so undemocratic fundamentally, and that's because we have an undemocratic constitution.
Hi, Kay. How are you doing?
John, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I agree. And there's another question in there about an Article 5. Personally, I think this is the power that
Oh, good.
we gave the government to change our constitution. This is a state convention. I believe that's very difficult to pull off, first of all. And secondly, the power resides with the people, not the state. So I think Article 5 convention is pretty faulted. I wouldn't advocate for that. Just wanted to chime in on that. I thought that was important.
Yeah, thank you, John.
And just to, if I may piggyback briefly on Greg's point, and I absolutely agree that part of the work is to get to the root, that in a world in which people are reacting, to get to the root of the perspective of, well, the lack of democracy is what's driving so much of this. And we're also living in a time where increasingly there are very explicitly, or much more explicitly, constitutional issues coming up. Gerrymandering, for example, is the perfect example of this. Gerrymandering has exploded. This is what a lot of people are talking about. Anyone, but again, I'm hammering on the left. The left should be all over this. The left should be all over this, talking about the need for proportional representation. This is why we can't get any other candidates going. This is why we're stuck in this two-party system. The left should be all over proportional representation. And then I argue to be all over proportional representation, honestly and faithfully, is to look at, well, what are the attempts that have been made and where are they blocked? Because there have been attempts made and our existing constitutional structure stops them. And just to talk about that, get that out there.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that again is what
Yep.
Aaron Lippart said, that his priority would be to establish proportional representation in all of our elections. So it's very important. Yeah.
What do you two think of the question or comment in the chat of, hey, the tech bros and Supreme Court have thrown the Constitution out the window. So what's the point of trying to replace a Constitution that nobody's observing anyway? What do you two think?
I'm looking for that comment. Where is it? In the chat?
In the
Or-
chat.
In the chat.
Okay,
Yeah.
let me see. Trump and tech bros, Supreme Court has thrown out the Constitution. Well, right. I mean,
Oh, good.
it's basically run amok. It's the whole system is collapsing before our eyes. And I talked with futurist Peter Leiden about this, and he's saying all of our systems are collapsing right now. That's why everybody's freaking out. But what they don't see is that all these new systems are going to emerge. However, even Peter Leiden wasn't really focused very much on the new political system that could emerge if we began to think and organize for that. So, yeah, I mean, let them kind of run the ball out. I think this political system is in its last days, and all the more reason why we should be urgently organizing to discuss what a new democratic constitution would look like. If we don't do that, we may end up in a much more difficult situation before we know it.
Thank you, John. Luke, do you have anything you want to add before we finish up?
Yeah, the other thing I'd add is I also like to frame the conversation in the ways in which the Constitution still very much is working. The Supreme Court, which is an unelected product of our Constitution, is still making decisions that people find absolutely abhorrent. The
Oops.
Senate is still passing and not passing that has to do with representation. You can have them approve something, and their majority might not actually relate to a majority of the population. So it's only so useful, I think, to say that the whole thing is sort of going out the window, because in a way that things are breaking down, absolutely, we still are very much living in a situation in which the political system created by the Constitution is having.
Yeah, agreed.
Kind of breaking up there. I put in the chat my email address if individuals who ask, what can we do? Little shameless self-promotion. If people want to be involved in the Move to Amend effort, feel free to reach out to me and be happy to plug you in.
Yeah.
And you're part of the
Looks
work.
like we lost Luke.
Luke was freezing periodically throughout. So.
Yeah. But I mean, looks like we're at time. I want to thank you all for your presentations, your thoughts, your well laid out thoughts to these questions. Also the good questions, by the way. I really enjoyed them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you to everyone who made it out here. Really looking forward to sessions coming up.
All right. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your interest. Let's keep it going.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Here.